Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our first webinar on green finance, and we're very grateful to have Truman Semans for our first webinar in this series. Truman has very graciously agreed to tailor this webinar so that people, especially students who have very little familiarity with this topic, will learn a lot of the important basics around green finance and climate finance. So I'm very grateful for Truman Semans being here for this first Green Finance webinar. Now, introducing Truman is no easy feat, but I'd like to begin by saying he's got his undergraduate from a rival school down the road. He also earned his MBA from Duke University. And in addition, he's got a master's in international economics from Johns Hopkins. I think one of the things that's really interesting about Truman's career is that he's been at this from a very early stage. For many people, green finance is a relatively new concept, new term. Maybe people have a 10-year familiarity with it. But Truman's really been at it since 1992. And I think what's really interesting, because we're from kind of a similar generation cohort, most people who were interested in sustainability as we were looked more at advocacy, policy, science, education as a way to move the ball forward. Truman chose a very different direction, and I think now, particularly with all the gridlock and partisanship we've seen in our country, it seems like he took a very clever pathway in terms of making an impact. So Truman, could I ask you to tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and how you got into the space of green finance?
Sure, Greg. And first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to participate here. And I've appreciated very much my long association with IE and with what's going on around environment and sustainability at UNC. So thanks again. Yes, as as you sort of alluded, I've been involved in sustainability as it affects economic development and business and finance since near the dawn of time, and certainly since pretty early on in sustainable development being a thing. There are really three chapters to my work in the area, and I wanted to mention it because I think hopefully there'll be some touch points with the career interests of the students here. You mentioned that I did a degree in international relations and international economics at Johns Hopkins SAIS. And so I spent the first decade of my work in international development, both with technical NGOs working in developing countries, and then for 10 years as the global environment economist at the US Treasury Department, which may seem an unusual place to have a green person, but there I got a chance to work with international development institutions like World Bank, IFC, and the other multilateral banks, and to work with the Global Environment Facility. I was the lead on that, which is sort of a thing that straddles the UN and the multilateral bank system. I was also during that time the financial mechanisms lead on the U.S. climate negotiating team. So having had the background in international relations from SAIS was really helpful there. During that period, as you remember, when it came to green investing in the private sector, it was pretty much around, it was very early stage, a lot of kind of clean tech and venture capital. The only sort of mature areas were around things like pollution control equipment on power plants and things like that. in any case, the next chapter, then I left government after the Clinton administration in '99, and decided to go into areas that paid a bit better, and also you can do a lot in government. It's I was able to do tremendous things there, but it's also very frustrating. So I switched gears and started consulting right away while I did an MBA back down here in North Carolina at Fuqua. Went from there to McKinsey. I started a consulting firm around sustainable development, but particularly around companies doing sustainable products and services in emerging markets. Went to McKinsey right when it looked like they were going to start a big environmental practice, which collapsed along with the dot-com boom, and went back to the firm that I had started. Except I took a brief period out of consulting for 3 years to go back to sort of the intersection between policy and investment and business with what if it doesn't look like there are a couple of people that are old enough to remember the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. It's now called C2ES, and it was really the top think tank on environment and policy at the time. I ran a thing called the Pew Business Environmental Leadership Council, which was basically a business association of companies that were very active around climate, both climate business and climate policy. And out of that, we developed a thing called the Climate Action Partnership, which US CAP, which happy to discuss if anybody's aware of that and wants to understand sort of how some of those public-private NGO business types of things run. The third chapter of my work coming out of there was in management consulting with a firm called Green Order. We worked with General Electric, General Motors, large chemicals companies like Dow and DuPont, big utilities like Duke Energy, National Grid, PG&E, pulp and paper companies, but even companies in very different areas like Disney and HP on making investments around products and services and capital projects and corporate strategy decisions, taking account of what was happening around green in the economy and where markets were valuing environmental performance or attributes. More and more over the time of my management consulting, my clients increasingly were large financial institutions like Citi, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, private equity firms like KKR, by this stage, so we're talking about, now around 2010, 11, 12, what had been venture stage stuff had matured into really a green, not a green sector, but really environmental sustainability and companies focused on that being mature and present with very tested technologies and the like across almost every sector. So there was more and more opportunity for investing in every asset class and a need to bank the space. So that's why my work and a lot of the work of management consultants around sustainability shifted toward the financial space. So all along this period, all the way back to those NGO days in the early 90s, I'd been working with directly and leading teams in quantitative approaches to understanding the impact and importance of environmental sustainability in economic development and investment decisions. And that started literally back in the 90s with to do it really in a sophisticated way, working with large programs that couldn't be run on a desktop computer. They had to be run on a mini mainframe. And then sort of fast forward then up to the work that I just mentioned, working with financial institutions and companies like Google on their financial decisions. And we took by 2014 or so, took this modeling of understanding and being able to develop scenarios to look forward at how environment and sustainability would shape markets in the future. We took that modeling to the very end of Excel. I mean, literally to the very end, where the models were so complex that it took weeks to cobble them together and run them, and they were very fragile. One of the reasons why I mention all of this is, data and data science, no matter almost what you want to do in this field, is important to have at least some fundamental understanding, if not a deep understanding. That led up to what I'm doing now, Greg, and have been doing the last 5 years, which is progressively moving toward better data and analytics for scenario-based investment decision-making and decision-making by corporations, by governments and regulators, and by communities on mitigating greenhouse gases and building resilience. So a bit of a long story there, but hopefully, let's make all of those stages and areas of work fair game in questions from the class and other participants.
Thanks for that plug on data analytics. We're always pushing our students to go down that direction in terms of being a super portable skill set that even if they're not sure where they want to make their mark, they'll be able to use that skill set. Something else I want to ask you that's kind of aimed at students is a lot of students tend to think that the really important innovations in society are going to be made by engineers, by PhDs in material science. Why should a really intelligent student consider finance as an area to go in? What's the contribution that finance is going to make to sustainability?
So I'll try to answer it briefly, and then maybe I'll depend on you to do follow-up questions to drill down in the areas that you think are most helpful. Mm-hmm. Whether you're talking about meeting the ambitious but crucial goals of the Paris Climate Accords, or any of the other really large-scale challenges in sustainability, biodiversity, sustainable oceans, any of these things, you could get the policy right, the technology right, and even changes in behavior right. But if you do not have much larger scale investment and shifting of investment out of the kinds of economic activity that are creating the problem into solutions, we're screwed. I mean, just full stop. So just for the climate piece of that, we are currently short at least $1.2 trillion a year in the investment needed to reach Paris goals. That's just to say that if you want to have impact, it's very important to have impact in the areas of policy, in technology, in social sciences and human behavior. But all that could go as best as hoped, and unless we also have innovation around finance, new financial instruments, new financial strategies, and very importantly, the ability to move the very large pots of money from pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, and the kind of financing that large commercial banks make, we're facing disaster. It's another reason to do it. I mean, let's be. I think it's always useful to be kind of frank about the money, right, for individuals and people. It's life's expensive, and some people get themselves into a really tough spot career-wise in some of the career paths that they choose relative to their needs. So I think that's a valid thing to consider. A 30-year-old ESG specialist who has done an undergrad and an advanced degree and gone into work with sort of a Wall Street financial institution, will be making, 200 to $225,000. So that's a consideration as well. A last thing I'd say about it is, there, there's finance and investing, but there's so many different pieces in that. There are a lot of different types of sort of ways to be sort of involved in sustainability. It's different asset classes. So if you're really into tech and all that kind of a thing, you can be involved. You're going to need an MBA and probably some startup experience, but you can get into venture investing and private equity. There are ways of, there are a few jobs and less that are pure sustainability and ESG and sort of sciencey type jobs in these large institutions. So that's a possible route to go. And then increasingly, they're ESG analysts, they're different kinds of financial folks. There are also some really cool jobs with NGOs that are focused on finance. So you can kind of have the best of both worlds.
Thank you. I think there's a question that's kind of related. I think we'll take questions from the chat as they're relevant to what you're saying. There's a question, people hedging a lot of risk with green sustainable ETFs and shareholders want more out of their investment. Do you see that there's a large shift currently happening? That's from Joshua Dillon. Do you see that?
Yeah, I see that. I see that in the chat. So I'm just so I might parse that out. So corporate sustainability is indeed a big thing coming up, there are an increasing number of shareholders who do want green performance out of their investments. That's happening at a sort of a what we call retail level, so individual households and the like, but it's definitely happening in a very big way with large institutional investors. So, for example, my organization, OS Climate, works with one of the largest asset owners in the world. That's Allianz. It's an insurance company, but they have they are also a very large investment manager, and if you include all of their investment management activities and PIMCO, which is a very large investment manager that they own, they manage about $6 trillion. So literally several percent of the total wealth of the world, and Allianz was a founding member of a thing called the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, which has pledged to have net zero emissions in their portfolio by 2050, but also to set 5-year concrete quantitative goals against which their progress will be measured. They've just released those, so there are about 30 large pension and sovereign asset owners that have made pledges under the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. There are several other very large institutions, some of the largest pensions in the world, that have made similar commitments outside of the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance. And so coming back to your question, Josh, they are not only looking to sort of hedge their exposure to environmental risk, but they are, which is a very important thing, but they're also looking to proactively find ways of generating excess returns, alpha, in a risk-adjusted way, by finding the best opportunities, finding the companies that are best in class, and going to succeed best in the transition to a low carbon economy, and to find, if not directing them directly, to find managers and passive products like ETFs that reflect both that risk management and that opportunity investment.
Thank you. I have another question. I'll paraphrase this one from Aditi. We've heard a lot of politicians around the world link COVID and climate change, that this solution for getting our economies going again after COVID have to be linked to doing something about climate change. Aditi is interested in COVID and ESG investing. She's wondering if COVID will actually help more investors adopt an ESG philosophy, or do you think COVID could actually hinder movement in this direction?
So it's a great question, and I would point you to some of the. There we go. Thanks for putting the Net Zero Asset Alliance link in there, Kirsten. So Aditi, I would kind of point you to a couple of people who have been who are much more eloquent on these on that topic than I. I'll say a little bit about it. Mindy Luber is the president of probably the most influential NGO in the sustainable investing space in the United States, called Ceres, CERES. And if you're not familiar with it, then sort of take a look there. You'll find material from Mindy addressing this. I'm also going to, I'll try to drop into the chat here. Hold on a second, let's see. This also was a kind of an important subtopic in a report that I helped to co-author, and that was released in September, called the Commodity Future Trade Commission report on managing climate-related market risk, which addresses not just commodities, but the steps that regulators and financial sector supervisors across all of the agencies can do, and all of the regulated entities, financial institutions, can do to address risk. And COVID comes up there. So I'm going to drop this in the chat. One of the things that COVID has done is to sharpen the mind of the investment community and of regulators to systemic risk. So climate change is a systemic risk, and what that means, if you're not familiar with the term, it's worth looking up if you're not familiar with it. There are some kinds of risk that are specific to a sector, that are specific to a country, that are specific to an asset class, and most of those risks you can manage those risks by diversifying your investments, but with systemic risks, where there are where the risk spreads across all geographies and asset classes and sectors, and where there are sort of secondary and tertiary effects that roll back and forth, you can't do that. The only way that you can manage is is to address the root problem, but also increase the resilience and the ability of different parts of the economy and the financial system to respond. So I like that. Slow burning pandemic is a great term, and I think that's accurate. Although there are some um, quite serious shocks that can happen very quickly to the global economy from either having to jam on the brakes with policy responses, or even we are looking at the potential for years of combined physical impacts that are so great in a given year in just such a way, particularly if it's against the backdrop of other things like wars or future pandemics, where it can be actually just destroy a lot of the financial system. So that's all I'll say on it. But it's a great question and worth further study.
I'd like to shift our conversation a little bit. I think when we think about things like green finance, ESG investing, the whole idea of standards, who sets the standards, how important are standards? And I wanted to just ask you a little bit about the work of Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and two other important entities that have been helping create the framework for people in this space like you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to put also just in here a link to, I think, one of the things that kind of helps to make sense of all this for a lot of people. So I put in there the part of the FASB, which is a visualization, a map that reflects the standard that they developed. So one of the things that was sort of so crucial, has been so crucial in moving the ball forward on sustainable investing and ESG, has been the identification of exactly what are the variables that are environment or social or governance related, i.e. not directly financial. What are the variables that can actually have a significant impact on a company or a project's cost, revenues, the overall value of the asset, other aspects of liability and value. And before the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board came along, there were a couple of efforts, but they were really super broad, like the Global Reporting Initiative and some of the early efforts by Carbon Disclosure Project, which is now called CDP. SASB was a great leap forward, and I'll come back to that question, Aditi. SASB was a great leap forward that brought together literally hundreds of experts across various industries, both sort of people that understood the industries from the corporate side and investors, and wrangled through to consensus on what the most, this is an important term for you guys to know, what are the most material factors and variables when it comes to essentially financial analysis to understand how climate or other environment and social factor situations affect markets and investments. The other ones to keep an eye on are the CDSB, so that's the Carbon Disclosure Standards Board in Europe. Well, of course, the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is not really a standard, but it's a framework for disclosure. And then a number of different things that are happening in the European Union one of it's pretty wonky, but the two ones that are worth, if you want to know anything about the space, understand how they impact the space, are first a thing called the NFRD. So it's the non-financial disclosure regulations of the European Commission. And then the other is a thing called the EU taxonomy, the green taxonomy, which basically identifies other activities and metrics for measuring those activities that are more on the green side. So how would you make an accurate determination of whether one company is greener than another in the automotive sector, for example? So those are the ones that I would look at, Greg.
Okay. It sounds like a lot of leadership is coming out of Europe. How impactful have been the UN principles for responsible investment? Have they?
They honestly, and others might disagree, but for a long time they hurt more than they helped. And that can be said for some of the other large organizations that are sort of, green NGOs or green intergovernmental organizations. So when, for a long time, PRI, Ceres, and others basically set up broad principles that a company could sign on to, become a signatory, but still be despicable polluters. And so is basically a greenwash mechanism. In both of those cases, Ceres and PRI and the leadership, the heads of those organizations are good friends. So, I would say this in front of them as well. They are working to tighten the screws and raise the bar and make it so that the signatories and their commitments actually mean something and are changing behavior and don't allow for really destructive action. But they're only able to do that so quickly without kind of disrupting their whole business model. And that's where initiatives like on the investor side, the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance come into play. And on the corporate side, one of the ones that I'd point you to is the Climate Action 100 plus. So that's a set of companies that have made some of the stronger commitments around the Paris Accords, and voluntary commitments, if they are specific enough, can really move things, because then NGOs are going to track carefully what's happening. Institutional investors are going to say, you committed to this and this and this, and you're not meeting that. What's the problem? So important to look at those as well.
Thank you. Maybe now is a good time to dive back into some questions. Would you like to take on the question by Aditi on sustainable consulting? It anticipates the foot on the brake policies that are going to push companies to adopt standards in a short period of time.
Yep, and I'm going to drop in, hold on. This is maybe not the best link, but you'll be able to find what we're looking for here. So the UNPRI commissioned from a great econ firm, Vivid Economics, a set of scenarios with assumptions about the pathways, particularly for policies, and how those would change and how they might change very abruptly if we see the kind of rapid acceleration of physical impacts. So the inevitable policy response is the name for those scenarios. They are, by the way, the IPR is going to be run through the models that we're developing in OS Climate. So to your question, absolutely. At least smart sustainability consultants are very much looking at the inevitable policy response and others to understand what's going to happen and what some of the signposts are that would if you see those signposts where you would expect to start to see policy shocks coming soon after. Like, for example, one of those signposts, Biden, Harris. That is a signpost for forthcoming, tighter policy and regulation and other measures in the U.S.
I'd like to shift gears a little bit and focus a bit on ESG investing. And this question seems a little simplistic, but I know a lot of the people that are involved in this webinar today are coming out of the environmental community. And I think when people think about ESG investing at a very crude level from an environmental lens, they tend to think of it as being very focused on the environment. Can you tell us where social and governance factors fit in and how investors seek to strike a balance among those different factors and why it's important that the social and governance factors are included?
One thing that I would say about that, Greg, is so there's considerable differences in the quantifiability and the maturity of, to your earlier point, standardized metrics in various areas of environment and between environment and social and governance. So there's some very broadly accepted metrics around governance. Others, so things around, for example, presence of racial and gender diversity on boards, things like that. When it comes to social, there's a lot less quantification. Things are harder. Qualitative investment assessment is really important, and so it's challenging essentially to do it all at once, but it's crucial. One of the things that I think we've as a society we've seen is that earlier efforts at environmental protection and even sort of greenhouse gas mitigation led to some outcomes that disadvantaged communities, that essentially pushed polluting communities, and this is true beyond climate to all kinds of things, into lower income communities that were not able to didn't have a voice to protect themselves, and where legislatures and state governments weren't doing their job protecting those. Despite what I said about the difficulty of measuring the social side, there have been great advances there, and there's some really great, very experienced managers who have developed very effective ways of directing capital to companies and projects that perform well. Not just on sort of the quantifiable climate and energy metrics, but and some of the other environmental, but social metrics as well. And there's a strong body of literature in economics and finance that has demonstrated that the top half of managers that are well established in that space have performed at or above the market from a standpoint of risk-adjusted returns. This is one of the things that this is controversial, but I feel like I want to say it right now. If it is not profitable, it is not scalable. And so I want you guys to reflect on that, because there has been billions and billions of dollars wasted on well-intentioned in some cases, or feel-good types of funds or projects or companies, but that were not able to be profitable. Now, there are a lot of things that need to be done where you blend concessional money. I know, Greg, we're going to probably touch base on this later on. Very important things that need to be done that will never be profitable, and figuring out ways to finance those things. But I mean, for the large scale change that we need, whether it's on climate or biodiversity protection or other types of things, it is crucial that we identify and invest in the things that can be profitable, because those are the only things that are going to attract funding on the hundreds of billions, trillions scale that's needed for global change.
Thank you. And I do want to follow up on that. I think a lot of people think there's a lot of altruism behind ESG investing, and people have fear because they want a return on their investments. Can you tell us how people bridge ESG considerations and financial performance? What do investment strategies typically look for when they're using an ESG lens, and we've got data now. What are the results generally look like when people do apply an ESG lens?
So one of the things that I think, kind of before answering your question, first, sort of as an investor, as an individual, or as a family, let's say, or as a family office, it's there's a range of different things that you do with your time, talent, and treasure, right? You might do a ton of volunteer work. You might give a lot of money to environmental organizations and social organizations. You might do some investing that is not holding forth the promise of having at or above market returns, but okay returns, and that are doing great work in areas where it's just not possible to be profitable, like microenterprise banking, for example, some of those types of areas. But then for a portion of the investment, and this is true not just for individuals, and it's also true for endowments and some of those kinds of things. That a certain amount is going to be invested for retirement savings, and or invested so that it continues to fund the activities of a nonprofit or a foundation, or look after pensioners, right? So so that I just wanted to, there's that kind of spectrum, and it's important to think about. The other is, so how does that connect to ESG investing? So actually, Greg, I'll send you afterwards. I've got a slide, and I'm not going to be able to dig it up quickly enough now, but that sort of maps a bit of what I just said. And there's a big difference between impact investing, which is not necessarily at or above market, but has the sort of the net result in terms of economic and financial impact and results, and the benefits for society that they create are really what you're all about. So that it's important to kind of think about that as an area, and then it overlaps a bit with ESG and responsible investing, and then sort of over there on the sort of the far side is a bit what I was talking about, and which OS Climate focus on, which is investing that is about about performing at or above the market in ways that also achieve progress toward Paris climate goals and the conventional biodiversity, et cetera.
Thank you. I've got a few more questions, but I know you have a hard stop at 5 o'clock, so I'm going to ask one last question and then open it up to others, since I want to leave at least 10 minutes for Q&A. I know we already have one question in the chat, but you, in your answer, just started to get into your current venture. can you talk a little bit now more specifically about climate investing and tell us about OSC? Where did the idea come from, and what sort of impact are you aspiring to?
Yeah, I will. I just wanted to pull up something to answer one of the other questions here. I'll come back to that. So OS Climate is a nonprofit initiative that is housed within the Linux Foundation, and the big idea behind what we're doing is taking the community-based open source approach that has been a massive engine for innovation in the tech sector and in the life sciences sector, and apply that to the problems around data and analysis for climate-aligned investing. When I mentioned earlier in the call that that we've got to solve the finance problem or we're screwed even if we get everything else right. The biggest barrier to the biggest solvable barrier to rapidly scaling up and closing that 1.2 trillion annual gap is providing trustworthy data that reveals the sort of the true price of climate related risk across markets, and the analytic tools to be able to factor that into investment decisions. That's what we're doing in OS Climate. Community-based open source. So that's basically, it's about a highly organized structure of governance and licensing and collaboration structure and technical standards that allow large numbers of people to work on specific technical projects and challenges. So every one of you is exposed and uses the Linux operating system every day because it's every one of them every one of these uses them. Almost every traffic system uses Linux. Most building control systems use Linux. Most payment systems use Linux. The Linux operating system, which is the most widely used operating system in the world, wouldn't exist except for the fact, and couldn't exist except for the fact that 25,000 people have contributed pieces of code to build out a thing that is just so much more capable than other operating systems like Windows or the Apple Opera iOS, and is able to work in all these different sectors. The vaccines that we're all so eager to see come forward for COVID are also helped by this collaborative open source approach. I'm going to just drop into the chat link to our website, and happy to. We're always on the lookout for interns and have a great experience with really talented people from UNC. So let me make this pitch right now. If you're interested in sustainable finance, and particularly if you're interested in sort of data science and these kinds of things, we'd love to talk with you.
Great. We'd love to find great opportunities for our students. So thank you for that. So I want to get now into more of the questions from the audience. Joshua Dillon has a question that's related to what you've been talking about. He wants to know how, is there a way fintech is innovating a sort of climate risk assessment for individual investors as well? If so, what does that look like?
Yeah, hold on, let me, I think the easiest way is to show you. So there's some great things that are out there, and but hold on, one of the things that we're going to, I think, do within OS Climate. Let's see here. Sorry, just scrolling through a deck. Oh, come on. I'm going to just take one more sec and try to dig up a picture, which will hopefully make this clearer. So I'll send something to you, Greg, after this. I'm just not finding what I wanted to, but I'll just, oh, there it is. All right, I'm going to just share my screen just a sec. All right. So what you're looking at here is, this is a tool that we anticipate will be built in a couple of different ways, both by some commercial banks and possibly sort of an open source version on the OS Climate platform. So one of the areas where individuals really can make a big difference is the choices that they make about their retirement savings. So, I mean, on average, each of you over the course of your careers are going to save, possibly, actually, almost probably, a couple few $1,000,000 over the course of your earning lifetime. How that is invested is crucially important. So, right now it's very heavily invested in these things. And there are choices that you can make to both sort of finance your retirement and the welfare of your family, and look after the planet by selecting funds that are mitigating risks here and reducing their impacts around fossil fuels and greenhouse gases, and shifting into these areas as well. So what you're just looking at here is where you look at your retirement savings plan, be able to compare it to others, and then click to green your portfolio and see a range of different other options for different fund managers who could invest your money. So, Josh, that's sort of the one that we're working on, but I think we'll see a tremendous amount of innovation in this space. One of the things that I would draw your attention to is PCAF. Let's see. Yep. So I'm going to drop in a link here. So the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financial is a group of banks that now includes some of the largest banks in the world, but also a whole range of smaller financial institutions that are moving toward commitments to reduce what is called financed emissions. So those will, one of the things that will happen is a lot of their, you'll have the ability to actually bank with an institution that is actively trying to change their whole lending portfolio to be more Paris aligned.
Well, thank you. We've only got 4 more minutes. I haven't seen any more questions come into the chat. I guess I'll just open it to you for final comments. Interested maybe the evolution in this space, especially with you mentioned Allianz. BlackRock is another one that seems to really be kind of laying down markers as to where the future is going. What are your final thoughts for students about this space?
I would just urge that no matter what, if you're going to do a career in sustainability in one area or another, even if it's really aimed at the sciences, I think it's really really important to understand uh, how investment and corporate decisions are made, even if you don't get to the point of really getting deep and building yourself a toolkit of knowledge in that area. For those that want to get into sustainable investment and finance, I would say one of the things that you may want to consider is not going to get an MBA and instead putting in the time and effort to become a certified financial analyst, and you basically it could be a much more important credential. Another thing is the direct route is not always the best route when it comes to sustainability. So just getting your cred and quals in in a sector that interests you in companies, in a non-green area, and then come back over to sustainability, or a job in finance that's not necessarily sustainable and then coming back to it, that's an okay path as well, sometimes better. And because there's a lot more, one of the clear trends that's happening is there is a lot more jobs for people that are finance first and then learn green than the other way around. And I think that's true in business as well. So thanks again, Greg. I hope that this has been useful for everybody, and to the extent that at some point later in the year, drilling down and spending some time talking a little bit more, deep and detailed on any of the topics, be happy to do it. So thanks again for the opportunity, and definitely to all those that are participating. Please watch carefully what we're doing at OS Climate if it sounds interesting to you, and let us know if you're interested in getting involved.
Well, thank you so much, Truman. This has been really enlightening, and I know students and others got a lot out of this, and I hope you'll see some excellent interns coming your way in the future. You're a great interning with you is a great way to get foot in the door for students, kind of learning the ropes and thinking about how to take next steps.
Take care, everybody. Thank you again, Greg. Thanks, Kirsten and Brenda. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Goodbye, Truman.